So I just finished reading The Technology Trap by Benedikt Frey. This was a huge book, 15-hour audiobook. Kind of regretted it halfway through, but I pushed through, and there were some pretty interesting things that I found out. So starting at the beginning, technology trap. So you have the automation of things, that's what the book is about, and you have the government and the people's reaction to that, both blue collar and then the richer people and the government. So in the beginning, you have the government who's scared of an uprising from the poor people. And so what they would do is they would make all these laws against, what I would call progress and automation and things like that. And so they would do anything they can to make sure that everyone's working, because if no one's working, or if a lot of people aren't working, they're going to riot. And they also really, really liked farming, the governments did, because that would have all these people, it would keep them very occupied, and they'd be very far apart so they can organize. Cities were sort of their enemy back then, and when I say back then, I'm thinking this is like the 1600s or so. Industrial Revolution happened around maybe the 1850s. I guess 1750s is when the government started changing their mind. And so when I'm talking about the government now, it's basically England. And so they didn't like when people had free time, and they didn't like when people were together and could organize, because they wanted to maintain their monarchy. And so they start trading with all these other countries. And now all of a sudden, they want to be the dominant one in trade. And so that sort of changes a lot, because you can't be dominant in trade and also very against progress and automation. So they start actually favoring, the right to own land and all different things like that help out the business owners and the merchants and those types of people. And so that is now at the detriment of the blue collar. I don't know if they had collars back then. Blue collar people. So they did not like that, but the government was like, too bad, we can't, fall behind all these other countries. We're going to get killed, and we need to make sure that we have the biggest, pile of money and machine to make money, and therefore military, and then we could rule the entire world. First England, then world, is essentially how they got into actually being pro-industrialization. And so when people start losing their jobs, they do get mad. And now the government is saying too bad, whereas in the past they were like, no, you can't take those jobs. And when people would make things in the past, new inventions, they would try to bill them as being labor enhancing, or you used to have to use skilled labor, now you're using unskilled labor. And so you're sort of reducing the cost of the labor, something like that. And now they're finally free to admit, hey, you're going to need less people if you're running with this machine rather than this one. So that was a big thing, huge change. That was the main turning point that got us into automation in general. Before then, we had all the technology to actually have automation and have tons of progress, but all the governments were against it because they were afraid that people would revolt if they start losing their jobs. And so, as I was saying, when people lose their jobs, it's not a good thing for them. Now, long term, it's better for everyone when we have more automation, because the only way the average person could have more is for everything to be done more efficiently and, have all these new inventions. But when we talk about the long term, we're talking about maybe 50 years in some cases. And so back then, I think the average person lived to be 30. And so we're talking long term, and then short term is their life. So in the short term, they're going to suffer, but in the long term, they're going to be better off. But when you're talking about the short term being 30 years and their lifespan being 30 years, they're never going to be better off. And so that's why you would see tons of revolts and smashing of machines and stuff. Even still today, if people are thinking the short term is 50 years and they start working at 20 and they're going to die at 80, maybe the last 10 years of their life, they're going to start seeing the benefits. But overall, for the person who's fired, it's not a good thing, despite it being good for society. And so we sort of need a way to fix that. I'm very libertarian, so I don't really want the government to be like, let me take the money and give it to those people. But maybe something like a pension, voluntarily given as a perk. We sort of saw a loss of pensions. There's this growing theme of distrust where the company doesn't trust the employee to stay with them, and then the employee doesn't really trust the company. Whereas before it'd be like you pick a company, you stick there, you work your whole life. And we're sort of seeing this hollowing out of the middle class because no one has that sort of job path anymore. You only have the unskilled labor and the white collar, and the AI and stuff right now is like squeezing out the middle class and pulling everyone apart. And that's what makes people angry and Marxist, as he says. Despite this author being, I mean, he's kind of in the middle, but I'd say a little bit more to the left, if anything. So what I thought was interesting was he was saying there's that gap. And I always hear the average person who goes to college earns $1 million more in their lifetime than the average person who doesn't go to college. And a very interesting fact from this book was they said that the average person who earns more nowadays is working more. So it's not that they earn more only because they work more, but because they earn more, they feel a need to work more so they can earn more. Whereas in the past, it would be the poor people work more, and then they end up with like the same amount of money to barely afford to live. Whereas now, the poor people work less than the rich people. And so the average person who goes to college works 2 hours more per day than the average person who doesn't go to college. I haven't run the numbers. I don't know the exact numbers, but I kind of feel like it may work out to be the same because you're saying you're making $1 million more, but you're also working 2 hours more per day for the rest of your life, whereas if you didn't go to college, you'd have all that money that you spent on college. So, maybe that's like in some cases $200,000. You invest that, compound interest, and that probably works out to be almost exactly the same as going to college, working more, and earning $1 million more. So that was very interesting, I think. And yes, that was basically the whole book. A lot of tiny, tiny details, but those were the main points that I thought were very interesting and wanted to share.